She grew up believing she was free, but at 21 she discovered that her life had already been promised before she even learned to say no. Sold in silence, promised to a man who loved her mother and never overcame her absence. But what started as a cold alliance transformed into something neither of them expected, because behind the contract there were hidden letters, buried secrets, and a love that didn't start from a touch, but from the courage to face the past and choose a new future. Get ready for an intense story of agreements, losses, old promises, and a baby that symbolizes the only revolution that truly matters: love. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and comment below. Where are you listening to this story from? Your like helps the channel grow and continue bringing emotional stories like this one. Share it with someone special. It started with a glance, fleeting, electric, and utterly forbidden. Jonathan Blake stood beneath the chandelier-lit ceiling of the Royal Embassy in London, surrounded by politicians, business tycoons, and billion-dollar egos. But his eyes weren't on the whispered oil deals in champagne flutes. They were on her, Claire Morgan, the only daughter of William Morgan, the very man whose empire had threatened to swallow Jonathan's father's tech dynasty for decades. She stood across the hall like a quiet rebellion wrapped in silk. Her emerald gown clung to her body with the same elegance that defined her name. Claire Morgan was a legacy, a symbol, yet the moment her eyes met his, she was no longer just a name. She was a woman, one whose presence stirred something Jonathan hadn't felt in years: peace. Their first meeting wasn't meant to happen. It was supposed to be a polite nod across rival families, a silent acknowledgement of centuries-old animosity. But fate, in its usual cruelty, didn't care for family trees or corporate wars. It cared for timing. And that night, time bent in their favor. "Jonathan Blake," he said with a crooked smile, extending his hand across the marble bar where they both sought refuge from the spectacle. She didn't take it right away. "I know who you are." The tension between them could have shattered glass. But then Claire took his hand. "And you are exactly what my father warned me about." They laughed. It wasn't light-hearted. It was dangerous. Like two people laughing at the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong move meant a fall no one could survive. From that moment, everything spiraled. Diplomats made toasts. Billionaires negotiated futures. And in the corners of ballrooms and on rooftops in Istanbul, Jonathan and Claire became something unthinkable. Lovers. Not reckless, not naive, but deliberate, defiant. They met in secret, away from the cameras, away from the eyes trained to report every step of the Blake and Morgan heirs. Paris became their playground, New York their silence. In Claire's presence, Jonathan found stillness, and in Jonathan's arms, Claire found a world outside duty. But they were never truly alone. Every whisper of laughter carried the weight of legacy. Every kiss tasted of borrowed time. Jonathan would trace the lines of her collarbone and whisper, This could burn everything down." And Claire would press her forehead to his and answer, "Let it burn." Yet even in their rebellion, they knew the fire was coming. The world they were born into didn't allow for soft things. Not between the Blakes and Morgans, and especially not when both families had bled too much power to forgive the past. Still, they kept coming back to each other. Jonathan memorized the shape of her voice, the way she said his name when no one was listening, the scent of her perfume on his shirts long after she had left. He started marking time by her touch, before Claire, after Claire. They spoke often about running away, Istanbul, Florence, maybe even Marrakesh. Somewhere their names meant nothing. Somewhere they could forget who they were and become something simpler. But Claire always paused. "My mother gave up everything to be a Morgan," she said one night, as they watched the Seine glisten under the moonlight. "And I won't give up my name just to lose myself in yours." Jonathan respected that, loved her even more for it. She was steel wrapped in satin, fire hidden behind emerald eyes. She didn't want escape. She wanted change. And he wanted to give it to her. So he started planning. Quietly, cautiously, business trips that doubled as rendezvous. Stock moves to destabilize the Morgan stronghold. Collaborations with European tech firms that could build bridges where battles once raged. He thought he could build a world for them, piece by piece, quietly, strategically, but nothing about them was ever quiet. It was a photo that broke them, not leaked, not published, just discovered. A candid shot taken in Venice. Claire smiling in his arms, his lips brushing her temple, the Grand Canal behind them like a painting. It was tucked into the pages of a forgotten travel journal Claire kept hidden in her Paris flat, a journal her younger cousin found, a cousin whose father still served as the legal advisor to William Morgan. From there, the storm arrived with brutal precision. Claire was summoned to Dubai. Jonathan was recalled to New York under the pretense of a collapsing satellite merger. But they both knew the truth. The affair had been exposed. The whispers had become roars. The final time they spoke, it wasn't in person. Claire's voice trembled on the line, brittle but composed. "They're arranging a marriage." Jonathan didn't speak. "He's older, a politician, safe." Silence again. "You won't fight?" she finally asked. "I will," he said. "Just not in a way that makes you the war." Those words broke her. He could have burned cities for her. She would have let him. But not like that. Not if it meant blood. So they said goodbye without saying the word, hung up with promises unspoken. And love, big, dangerous, burning love, died a quiet death over a phone call that should have lasted forever. Jonathan didn't watch the wedding live. He couldn't. Instead, he sat in the back of a smoky bar in Manhattan, eyes red, suit wrinkled, glass after glass numbing the storm inside him. But someone recorded the broadcast anyway, played it on the corner screen above the bottles of whiskey and regret. He looked up just once. Claire stood at the altar like a ghost, beautiful, untouchable, dressed in silence and surrender, and in that moment, something in Jonathan broke. Not like glass, but like steel. He walked out into the New York night and disappeared. And from that night on, Jonathan Blake stopped chasing love. He started chasing power. But love has a way of returning, even if it comes back wearing the face of the daughter of the woman you once lost. The day Claire Morgan became Claire Lancaster, it didn't rain. The sky over Dubai was relentlessly blue, almost mocking the storm that raged inside her chest. The wedding took place at the Lancaster family's ancestral estate, a sprawling marble monument to tradition and ambition. Politicians, royals, oil barons, and men who thought they owned the world gathered to witness a union that promised to keep empires intact. Cameras flashed, string quartets played, but Claire's hands trembled beneath the lace of her gloves. She stood at the altar beside Richard Lancaster, a man 20 years her senior, polished, powerful, and utterly indifferent to her soul. He wore duty like cologne. His touch was rehearsed, his smile constructed. He didn't want a wife, he wanted an alliance, and Claire was the currency. In the front row, William Morgan watched his daughter with cold pride, as if marrying her off to a political relic was the crowning achievement of his legacy. Her mother, long silenced by pills and sorrow, didn't even attend. The priest asked the question. Claire's lips moved before she could stop them. "I do." But in her mind, another voice whispered, "Jonathan's," whispering her name against her skin, promising a different life in a world that didn't exist. Thousands of miles away, Jonathan Blake sat in the shadows of a bar in Manhattan, his tie undone, his knuckles white around a glass of scotch. He hadn't planned on watching, but someone had turned on the screen above the bar, and there she was, his Claire, walking down the aisle in a dress that looked like surrender. He didn't look away, not even when the ring slipped onto her finger. Instead, he drank, slowly, bitterly, until her image blurred into nothing. That night, something inside him fractured, but he didn't scream. Jonathan Blake didn't break loudly. He broke inward, like ice cracking under pressure, silent, deadly. In the weeks that followed, he vanished from the public eye. No interviews, no board meetings, no traces, only whispered rumors that the prodigal heir had gone rogue. But Jonathan wasn't lost. He was transforming. In a rented flat on the Upper East Side, he rewrote everything, his identity, his company, his future. He started severing ties with the old guard, dismantling the toxic alliances his father had cultivated, and rebuilding his empire under the radar. This time not for legacy, but for control. Power was no longer a birthright. It was a weapon, and he would use it to protect the memory of the woman he lost, and the world they never had. Meanwhile, Claire learned how to disappear in plain sight. The Lancasters moved her to a penthouse overlooking the Persian Gulf, where servants bowed and chefs prepared whatever she didn't ask for. She smiled for cameras, shook hands with dignitaries, sat beside Richard at charity galas like a prized sculpture. But inside she was drifting. Every night she locked herself in the music room, her one request in the marriage agreement, and played the piano until her fingers went numb. Chopin, Debussy, even jazz. The melodies became her language of grief. She never spoke of Jonathan, not to anyone. But sometimes she'd sit by the grand window, look out into the endless desert sky, and whisper his name like a prayer. She kept a photo hidden inside a worn poetry book, taken in Paris, her and Jonathan laughing beneath the Eiffel Tower. A stranger had captured the moment, and she had paid them €100 for the film. It was the only proof that joy had once been real. A year into the marriage, Claire discovered she was pregnant. The news hit her like a wave of cold water. It hadn't been love, not even passion, just obligation, and yet a heartbeat. She considered everything: running, termination, silence. But in the end, she chose to carry the child. Not for Richard, not for her father, but for herself. It was the only thing in her life not dictated by men in suits. She named the baby Lily, and from the moment she held her, everything changed. Lily's eyes weren't Jonathan's, but Claire searched for traces of him in her daughter anyway, in her quiet stares, in the way she clenched her little fists while dreaming, in the calmness that settled in the room when she giggled. Claire poured herself into motherhood with a devotion that startled even her own cold heart. She sang to Lily, read to her, shielded her from the coldness of the Lancaster house. But always, always, there was a shadow. Richard didn't hold Lily until she was 3 weeks old. He nodded at her politely, as if she were a minor investment that might pay off in time. His world had no place for soft things. When Lily turned 1, Claire wrote a letter she never sent. "Jonathan, she's not yours by blood, but every smile she gives me reminds me of the life we could have had. I hope you're alive. I hope you're okay. I hope you haven't forgotten me. Claire." The letter stayed in her drawer. She never got the chance to send it, because one cold autumn morning, the plane carrying Claire and Richard from Geneva to Dubai vanished from the radar over the Mediterranean Sea. Wreckage was later found. Bodies recovered. The world mourned. The Morgans issued press statements. The Lancasters organized private memorials. But behind closed doors, the power struggle reignited. And in New York, when Jonathan received the news, his world stopped. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stood there holding the news clipping in his hand, staring at her name printed in ink, as if her entire life had been reduced to a headline. Something inside him died that day. And something else was born. A new Jonathan Blake. He didn't attend the funeral. He didn't light a candle. He didn't make a statement. Instead, he called his lawyers, his financial advisors, his network of global operatives, and he asked a single question. "Where is the child?" Because somewhere out there, Lily was alive, and she was all he had left of Claire. Lily Lancaster didn't cry when she was born. Not right away. The doctors said it was normal. Some babies took a few extra seconds to find their breath. But for Claire, those seconds felt like lifetimes. She held her breath, clutching the cold edges of the hospital bed in Zurich, until the sound finally pierced the air. A soft, broken wail that didn't sound like pain, but protest. As if even at her first breath, Lily already knew the world she was being born into wasn't the one her mother had hoped for. Claire looked into her daughter's eyes, and the world fell silent. She was beautiful, tiny, warm, with wisps of dark hair and skin like porcelain kissed by moonlight. Claire held her against her chest and whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "You'll never be alone. Not if I can help it." But somewhere, even as she spoke those words, she knew the cost of that promise. The birth was quiet, no press release, No media coverage. Richard was out of the country on official duty, and the Morgans had arranged for the delivery to happen privately, away from the cameras. It was safer that way. Cleaner. More manageable. But to Claire, it felt like erasure. Still, for the first time in years, she felt something close to hope. She spent hours just watching Lily sleep, memorizing her daughter's face, her breathing, the way her fingers curled around Claire's thumb. In those first weeks, they existed in a bubble, just the two of them. No last names, no empires, no ghosts. Claire would hum lullabies no one had sung to her. She told Lily stories she used to dream about when she was a girl, stories about cities that smelled like spice, forests that whispered secrets, and women who chose love over duty. But the real world crept in quickly. By the time Lily was 3 months old, the first nannies had arrived. By 6 months, Richard returned. He asked to hold her, more out of obligation than affection. Claire handed Lily over reluctantly, watching her daughter stare at the man who was technically her father with wide, confused eyes. "She doesn't smile at me," Richard noted, as if it were a glitch to be fixed. "She doesn't know you," Claire said softly. And she wouldn't. Not really. Richard's visits were brief, formal. He spoke of schedules, legacy, future image. To him, Lily was an heir, a responsibility, a branch on a family tree he planned to control from a distance. Claire refused to let that be her daughter's fate, so she began to keep a secret journal. Every giggle, every fever. The first time Lily rolled over, her first solid food, her first steps. They all went into pages Claire kept hidden in a carved box beneath her bed. It was the story of a little girl growing up in the shadow of dynasties, written not for power but for memory. She wrote letters too, not addressed to anyone in particular, but they always started the same. If you're reading this, it means you knew her, or you loved her, or maybe you're him. She never wrote Jonathan's name, but in every word, he lived, because even though Lily wasn't his, Claire sometimes caught glimmers of him in her, in the way she turned her head when music played, in her stillness when the world became too loud, in her eyes, curious, searching, full of questions she couldn't yet ask. Claire never spoke Jonathan's name aloud, not even when she was alone, but he was everywhere. In Lily's nursery walls painted the shade of the sky they once watched in Istanbul. In the music box that played the tune they danced to in Paris, in the way Claire sometimes caught herself whispering his name when rocking Lily to sleep, only to catch it in her throat. When Lily turned 2, Claire finally allowed a family photograph to be taken. She dressed Lily in a soft ivory dress, stood in the courtyard of their Geneva residence, and smiled for the camera, but the photo never made it to the press. Instead, Claire sent it to a private address in New York. No return label, no signature, just the photo and a single sentence scribbled on the back. "She looks like peace." And Jonathan received it. He found it in the middle of a storm, one of those long weeks when boardrooms bled ambition and allies turned into enemies with polished smiles. His assistant handed him the envelope like it was any other document. He opened it without expectation, and there she was, a child, not his, but his. Jonathan stared at the photograph in silence for minutes. Her eyes haunted him. They were Claire's. But also something more, something untouched by pain, as if life hadn't yet had the chance to ruin her. He read the words on the back and clenched his jaw. "She looks like peace." He didn't cry. Jonathan Blake didn't allow himself such indulgences, but for the first time in years, something thawed inside him, something dangerous. From that day on, he began watching over Lily, quietly, invisibly, like a shadow that only moved when no one was looking. He paid for private security around her estates, disguised as regular staff. He ensured the doctors she saw were the best, the nannies vetted by teams of professionals. Through proxies, he opened a fund under an alias, one that would one day cover her education, her passions, her freedom. He never interfered, but he was always there. When Lily learned to ride a bike in the Swiss countryside, he saw it from afar. When she performed at her first piano recital, he sat in the last row, hidden in the dark, applauding silently with hands that once held her mother. And each time he felt the same ache. This child, this girl, wasn't his to claim, but she was all he had left of Claire. and somehow that made her sacred. Then came the crash, the plane, the headlines, the names confirmed. Claire, gone, and Richard, gone. Lily, only 6 years old, was left orphaned. The world paused, the families acted, power shifted. But Jonathan moved with quiet urgency. He didn't petition for custody. That would expose too much. Instead, he ensured she was placed with trusted guardians, distant relatives with no political stake. He arranged for her to attend the best international schools under scholarship names no one could trace back to him. He hired therapists. He sent anonymous gifts, books, puzzles, music boxes, each one chosen with impossible precision. And Lily grew. From a distance, Jonathan watched her become more than he ever imagined. Curious, rebellious, fiercely intelligent. She asked questions teachers couldn't answer. She challenged rules. She learned to speak 3 languages before she turned 10. And when she played piano, Jonathan sometimes stood outside the school auditorium, eyes closed, letting the music hit the places grief had built walls around. She was becoming everything he and Claire had once dreamed of, but she didn't know him. Not yet. And perhaps that was mercy. Or perhaps it was only the beginning. The storm didn't come with thunder. It arrived in whispers behind velvet doors, in ink-stained contracts passed from hand to hand under chandeliers and silk. After Claire and Richard's deaths, the world expected war. The Morgan oil empire had no clear heir. The Blake Tech dynasty stood alone, stronger than ever, but surrounded by enemies cloaked in mourning suits. The vultures circled quickly. Factions rose within both families, old resentments resurfaced, and corporate sharks sharpened their teeth. Stocks wavered. Lawsuits loomed. Legacy trembled. That's when the proposition surfaced. It was Richard Lancaster's brother Charles who first said it aloud in a boardroom where the air smelled of cologne, old money, and carefully concealed desperation. "If we want to stop this bleeding," he said, "we need to unite, permanently, publicly." He slid a file across the table, slow and deliberate. Lily, the girl, the orphan, the last living tie between the Morgans and the Lancasters. She's the key. We offer her hand when she comes of age. In exchange, Jonathan Blake aligns with us. It ends the feud. For good. It was madness, it was brilliance, and it reached Jonathan in a sealed envelope, delivered not by a lawyer but by his father's oldest associate, a man who knew too many secrets to be refused. Jonathan read it once, then again, and again. His mind didn't race, it calculated. At first, the answer was a silent, immediate no. The thought of forcing Lily into the same trap that had destroyed her mother was unthinkable. Claire would rise from the grave and burn him to ash if he dared. But then, he thought of the girl with emerald eyes and piano fingers, of the way she carried herself in school performances, of how the world had already started carving a path for her without her voice, a path full of chains disguised as diamonds. And he remembered something Claire once said in Paris, one night after they'd made love, lying tangled beneath open windows and jasmine-scented air. "One day, I want my daughter to inherit peace, not battles." Jonathan stared at the window of his penthouse in Palm Springs for a long time that night. The city glittered below, silent, fragile. He poured a drink, didn't touch it. Then he made the call. "I'll accept the agreement," he said. The voice on the other end paused. Then, "With what conditions?" Jonathan's answer was quiet, absolute. "She turns 21, then she chooses. No sooner. You'll wait 16 years? I've already waited 3 since Claire died. I can wait 16 more." He didn't mention the real reason, that every year Lily lived unaware of him, she grew stronger, freer, that the last thing he wanted was to take that from her. That somewhere in the hollow chambers of his once broken chest, a heart still beat, and it still knew how to protect something precious, even from itself. The contracts were drawn, silent, binding. Guardians were chosen, trusts established. No press releases, no public announcements. Only a quiet alignment of empires now tethered to a promise neither party intended to break. Jonathan never visited her. But every birthday, he watched from a distance. When Lily turned 9, he sent her a globe, disguised as a gift from a family friend. It was antique, gold-rimmed, with countries carved in fine detail. Inside, hidden beneath the base, was a key. She never found it. At 11, he gifted her a first edition of The Little Prince, annotated in French. She read it cover to cover, twice. At 15, he sent her a telescope. It arrived anonymously. She never knew who sent it, but used it almost every night, staring up at the same stars he watched from halfway across the world. She wrote poetry, built science models, played piano like her mother, and at 17, she spoke on a stage in London, representing her school in a global conference on sustainable innovation. Jonathan watched the live stream alone, hands clasped behind his back, expression unreadable. "She has Claire's fire," someone whispered beside him. He didn't answer, didn't breathe. He just watched. When she turned 20, the tension began to rise. Her guardians began to press. Hints were dropped, invitations extended to meet potential suitors. She pushed back, gently at first, then with fire. She didn't want to be married. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She wanted to study architecture, travel, be free. And Jonathan remained silent. Until one night, as the world slept, he took out the envelope. The original contract, yellowed at the corners but intact. And he stared at the line that started it all. Upon her 21st birthday, the rightful union shall be enacted, aligning the Blake and Lancaster legacies in marriage. He folded it slowly, placed it back in the safe, and whispered into the empty room, "Only if she chooses me." What he didn't know was that, at that very same hour across the ocean, Lily sat on her bedroom floor, surrounded by scattered letters from her guardians. One of them hinted at a name she'd never heard before, Jonathan Blake, and that name stayed with her, like a ghost. Lily Lancaster grew up surrounded by privilege, but never truly touched by it. Her childhood was structured like a symphony, precise, rehearsed, performed for an invisible audience. From the outside, she was the ideal orphaned heiress, polished, composed, academically gifted. But no one saw the girl behind the discipline, the girl who learned early that being watched wasn't the same as being seen. Her guardians were kind, in the way strangers paid to raise someone else's child could be. They gave her good schools, international summers, the illusion of choice. But their affection was filtered through protocol. Their warmth never reached beneath her skin. From the age of 7, Lily sensed her life was not entirely hers. Her dreams didn't belong only to her. They were discussed in hushed voices outside her door. Scholarships appeared before she applied. Advisors pushed her toward diplomacy, then economics, then environmental engineering. Always noble, always strategic. Never asked, always chosen. She began to write in secret. Not diaries, too vulnerable. Instead, she wrote blueprints. For houses she dreamed of building, for cities with no walls, where names didn't carry weight. For bridges over oceans people weren't allowed to cross. Every design had the same foundation: freedom. At night, she played piano. Her mother's piano, the one that had survived the crash, restored and placed in her Geneva townhouse. No one ever told her where it came from. But every time her fingers touched the keys, something in her blood hummed with recognition. She would sit for hours, eyes closed, letting the notes rise like echoes from a life she never lived. She didn't know he was listening. Jonathan Blake never missed a performance. He never entered the room, never left a trace. But every recital, every scholarship gala, every public event where she appeared, he was there, in the shadows, behind tinted glass, on balconies, in the back rows. He watched her grow, from the awkward grace of adolescence to the sharp fire of adulthood. At 12, she punched a boy who mocked a homeless woman on the street. At 14, she hacked the school's grading system to protest biased rankings and left behind a note quoting The Little Prince. At 16, she refused to attend a royal dinner in Monaco unless she could wear a dress of her own design. Jonathan didn't interfere. He simply made sure she wasn't punished for being bold. Every time she took a risk, someone conveniently stepped in to shield her. A new headmaster, a softened press release, a financial donor to keep angry parents quiet. Lily never saw the invisible hands around her life, but she felt them, and it made her suspicious. She began to ask questions. Why does every door open before I knock? Why are people always watching me but never talking to me? Why do I feel like someone else is writing my story? Her guardians deflected with smiles. You're just special, they said. But it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a cage made of gold. At 17, she took a summer trip to New York under the guise of a school program. She walked the city for hours, drawn by something she couldn't explain, a current pulling her through crowded streets and silent museums. She stood outside a tower once, a glass and steel monolith that shimmered like a blade in the sun. The Blake Building. She didn't know why it felt familiar, or why the doorman looked at her like he recognized her. She walked away. But the name stayed with her. Jonathan watched the security footage that night. Her face, older now, sharper, but still achingly familiar. Claire's mouth, his silence, a haunting symmetry. He closed the video and sat in the dark for hours. He had promised to wait until she was 21, to give her the freedom Claire never had. But each year made the distance harder to bear. He wasn't the man he once was, not entirely. The edge remained, but so did the ache. And she was becoming something he didn't expect. Not just brilliant, unpredictable. She began to challenge everything. At 18, she rejected a full scholarship to Oxford in favor of an experimental university in Iceland focused on sustainable city planning. Her guardians protested. She went anyway. At 19, she gave a TEDx talk on invisible infrastructures, urban planning metaphors layered with personal rebellion. She never said it aloud, but everyone in the audience felt it. I know what it's like to live in a system you didn't choose. Jonathan watched the video, alone, again and again. Each time her voice cut deeper, not with accusation, but with something worse, truth. He had tried to protect her, but maybe in doing so, he had robbed her of the very thing he wanted her to have, choice. Then came the 21st birthday, and with it, a letter, elegant, formal, delivered by a man in grey. She opened it slowly, seated by a wide window in her new apartment overlooking Geneva's old town. Inside, a name, Jonathan Blake, a contract, a ring, and a date. It was the quiet that made her stomach turn. Not the words, not the letter, not even the name. It was the stillness that followed, the kind that only arrives when something sacred shatters. Lily sat motionless on the windowsill of her Geneva apartment, the morning sun bleeding through sheer curtains, painting the room in gold and ghost. The letter lay in her lap, the envelope torn with a kind of violence she didn't remember committing. Her fingers clutched the thick paper as if it could explain itself if held tightly enough. She read it again. A marriage agreement, signed before she could read, before she could speak, before she had even stopped playing with dolls. Her name, Jonathan Blake's name. The terms of a union arranged between ghosts, men who were now dead, and one who clearly wasn't. Her hands began to tremble, 21 years old. They waited for her like wolves just beyond the firelight. Her guardians hadn't mentioned this. Not once. Not in passing, not as a whisper, not as a threat. It had never existed, until it did. Until it arrived in an envelope wrapped in silence and sealed with legacy. The man who delivered it had been polite. Crisp suit, British accent. Expressionless. He called her Miss Lancaster. Told her he had something long overdue. Then he walked away, like someone had paid him to vanish with her shock. She picked up the ring that had come with the letter. Cold, heavy, platinum with a single black diamond. It didn't sparkle. It stared. And in that moment, something ancient and dangerous stirred inside her. She wasn't a romantic, not really. She had never been the girl who dreamed of veils and vows. But this wasn't marriage. This was transaction. She was the clause that sealed a deal, the prize for surviving the war her family had dragged her into. And they thought she would comply? They didn't know her at all. The next day she confronted her guardians, not with shouting, not with tears, with silence and questions, sharp, surgical. How long have you known? The woman, her primary guardian since she was 6, lowered her eyes. Since the beginning. You raised me to believe in independence. You encouraged me to speak, to dream. Was that all a performance? No, the woman whispered. It was protection. We wanted you to grow strong, so you could carry the weight of what would come. And what exactly is coming? A pause. Your future. Lily laughed then, bitter, hollow, the kind of sound that didn't belong to her. Not yet, but maybe someday it would. I'm not a future. I'm not a bridge. I'm not leverage. She stepped back. I'm not yours. She didn't wait for more lies. She packed her things in silence, left behind the piano, the city, the comfort. She took the envelope, the ring, and the fury. For 3 days, she disappeared. No one found her. Not in the official records, not through her credit cards, not on the cameras she had long since learned to avoid. She went off-grid, like someone born for it. And maybe she had been. Maybe something in her blood knew how to vanish before it was ever taught. When she resurfaced, it was in London, rain streaking the windows of a forgotten bookstore in Notting Hill, where she found an old copy of Wuthering Heights. She opened it. Inside, scribbled on the title page, were the words, "Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same." She shut the book. The name haunted her. Jonathan Blake, the tech mogul, the ghost billionaire. A name whispered in headlines, in boardrooms, in scandal, but also in admiration. Reverence, fear. She had read about him. Everyone had. But she had never seen him. Not in the flesh. Not in her memories. Until now. Because suddenly all the unanswered questions of her life rearranged around a single shape. The gifts with no sender, the scholarships, the shadows, the sense of being watched, but never touched. He was always there, wasn't he? Not father, not stranger, not lover. Something else entirely, something more dangerous. She took a train to Paris that night, sat in the same park her mother had once written about in a hidden journal she found as a child. The journal with pressed flowers and sketches of bridges and one single name written over and over in the margins. Jonathan. She remembered asking her guardian once when she was 12, "Did my mum love someone before Richard?" "She loved freedom," was the answer. Now she knew the truth. Her mother hadn't just loved a man. She had been torn from him. And Lily, she had been the cost of that love. The product, the compensation. A child born into a legacy built on sacrifice. She sat there for hours, the city moving around her but never through her. And when she stood, something in her had changed. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just whispered to herself as if reciting an old vow from another life. "They wrote my story without asking me. That ends now." She didn't know what Jonathan Blake would be like. She didn't care if he was powerful. She didn't care if he was kind. She cared that he had let this happen, that he had waited in silence while her life was decided for her, that he had played protector without ever offering her truth. And if he thought she would walk into a marriage like her mother had, he was about to learn that Lily Claire Lancaster didn't inherit obedience. She inherited fire. The air in Palm Springs felt artificial, too perfect, too controlled. As the car turned onto the private road leading to the Blake estate, Lily pressed her palm against the tinted window, staring out at the endless rows of olive trees, each one lined in a symmetry that felt like command, not nature. She had not been invited. She had announced herself. She had walked into the Blake Global lobby in Manhattan 4 days earlier, demanding an appointment. She used no titles, no charm, just her full name. The assistant's smile had faltered for the first time all morning. Within 20 minutes she had a one-way flight booked, a car waiting, and a time, Saturday, 10 a.m. Now, as the gates opened and the estate came into view, Lily realized she wasn't nervous. She was ready. For answers. For confrontation. For whatever lived behind the man who had haunted her life without permission. The mansion was all glass and shadow. Modern. Vast. Terrifying in its restraint. No guards visible. No staff to greet her. Only silence. The driver opened her door. "He's waiting for you inside." That was all. She stepped onto the stone path, feeling the heat of the desert beneath her flats, and walked straight through the doors. He was already there. Jonathan Blake. Standing at the far end of the room by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the horizon as if it owed him an apology. He didn't turn around. "I thought you might come." His voice was deeper than she expected, low, controlled, like gravel beneath silk. She didn't answer. He turned, and the world shifted. It wasn't that he was handsome, though he was. It wasn't the cut of his suit, or the grey threading through his black hair, or the sculpted calmness of his features. It was his stillness, as if he were a man who had already survived the end of the world and carried its silence with him. He studied her, Claire's mouth, her fire, but something else, something sharper, something that made his breath catch for the briefest second. "You've grown." She didn't flinch. "You've watched." A pause. "I've protected." She stepped closer, just 2 steps, not enough to reach him, but enough for the words to hit harder. "You've controlled." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I waited until you were old enough to choose." She almost laughed. "Old enough to choose what? A man I never met? A marriage I never asked for? A legacy I never wanted?" He said nothing. Lily's voice dropped. "Do you even know what it feels like to find out your life was sold by people who are already dead?" Jonathan looked away toward the desert. "Yes," he said, "I do." That silenced her for a breath. He turned back, eyes darker now, and for the first time his composure cracked. "I was 23 when your mother was taken from me. I watched her marry another man. I watched her raise his child. I watched her die." She blinked. His voice had softened, but not weakened. He wasn't trying to manipulate her. He was bleeding in front of her, quietly. "You loved her. I never stopped." Lily felt it then, a fracture inside her chest, sharp and quiet. She stepped forward again. "So why marry me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a drawer in the glass table beside him, pulled out a wooden box. Inside it, letters. Claire's handwriting. Lily recognized it instantly. He handed them to her without ceremony. No explanation. "She wrote to me," he said. "Even after the marriage, even after Lily was born, she never stopped writing." Lily's breath caught. "Why didn't you give these to me before?" "Because I didn't want to give you pieces of her. I wanted you to become whole on your own." Silence stretched between them, fragile but electric. Lily looked at the man in front of her, and something inside her, something feral and grieving and hungry for truth, rose to the surface. She didn't shout. She whispered, "Do you want to marry me or a memory?" The question hung in the air like perfume, heavy, inescapable. Jonathan stepped closer now, just a single step, and when he spoke, it wasn't the CEO, or the strategist, or the ghost. It was the man. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I never wanted to be in this position, and I know I'd burn every contract if you asked me to." She looked up into his eyes and saw it. Pain. Not arrogance, not confidence, not control. Real, human, broken pain. She hated him for it, and somehow didn't. "So what happens now?" she asked. Jonathan met her gaze, and for the first time in 2 decades, he didn't have an answer. The wedding was televised. Not in the way royal weddings are. No carriage, no cheering crowds, no fairy tale narrative. This was a corporate ritual, a statement, a performance, and every detail had been chosen with the precision of a military operation. The gown was Dior, ivory, and minimalist. The venue, a restored estate in Napa Valley, flanked by vineyards older than the country itself. The guest list was curated to reflect power, not affection. Diplomats, shareholders, journalists, billionaires. The bride and groom barely spoke. Lily stood at the altar like a sculpture, cold, perfect, distant. Jonathan beside her looked carved from the same stone. When the vows were spoken, no one cried. When the kiss was offered, it was barely a brush, a contract sealed in skin, not feeling. Behind the cameras, Lily's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. She didn't hate him, not entirely, but she didn't trust him, and trust, to her, was more sacred than love. They left the ceremony in separate cars, no honeymoon, just headlines. Jonathan Blake marries heiress Lily Lancaster in historic alliance, the end of a century-old feud and the birth of a new power couple. The billionaire and the orphan, marriage or merger. Lily didn't read them. She had lived enough headlines to know they only ever got one thing right: her name. The Blake mansion in Palm Springs became her new cage. A palace, really, with 10 bedrooms, 3 kitchens, and a view that made the desert look romantic. But luxury doesn't undo loneliness. The halls echoed with quiet. Staff whispered her name with politeness but no warmth. Every interaction felt choreographed, every space too curated, too controlled. Jonathan gave her the East Wing. She never asked for it. They ate meals at opposite ends of a glass dining table long enough to seat 20. Sometimes they didn't speak. Other times he asked how her work was going, brief, clipped, like a manager checking in on an investment. She responded in kind. "My thesis is progressing. I met with the Eco-Architecture Committee. I don't need your approval." To his credit, he didn't offer it. They lived like diplomats sharing a ceasefire. 2 worlds under one roof, parallel orbits, neither daring to collide. And yet, there were moments, strange, fragile moments. One evening she came back from a conference in Mexico and found a box on her nightstand. Inside, an antique drafting compass. It had belonged to Zaha Hadid. No note, just reverence. Another morning, she heard piano music echoing from the West Wing. Soft, imperfect, hesitant. She paused outside the door, listened. He was playing Claire's melody. It broke something in her, but she didn't enter. At night she often stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her suite, wrapped in a silk robe, staring out at the desert stars, wondering who he was when no one was watching, wondering if he ever truly slept. One night, she asked. They were crossing paths in the hallway, her heading to the kitchen for tea, him returning from the gym, towel slung over his shoulder, hair damp. "Do you sleep?" He paused. "Sometimes." She tilted her head. "What keeps you awake?" He didn't answer. Instead, he asked, "What keeps you from running?" She blinked. "I'm not afraid of you." His voice was quiet. "That's not what I asked." She stared at him for a long beat, then walked away. She didn't have an answer. But maybe that was the answer. They had been married for 6 weeks when the first article leaked. Sources claim Blake marriage is strategic only. Insiders speak of separate wings. No intimacy. She tossed the magazine on the counter, laughing bitterly. Even the press knows. Jonathan glanced at the headline. Let them talk. She looked up at him then, truly looked, and asked the question that had been curling like smoke in the back of her throat since the day she walked into his life. "Did you ever want this to be real?" His eyes didn't waver. "More than you know." Silence stretched between them, dense with memory, with ghosts, with everything they weren't saying. And then he added almost to himself, "But I've forgotten how to want things without destroying them." Lily stepped back, not from fear, from recognition, because part of her knew exactly what that felt like. Still, she didn't cross the line. Not yet. But the lines were blurring, every day a little more, and it wasn't hate keeping them apart. It was something far more dangerous, something neither of them knew how to name. It began with a storm, not thunder or rain, but wind. Hot, wild desert wind that rattled the windows of the Blake estate like something ancient had come back to haunt it. Lily stood barefoot on the balcony, the night pressing against her skin like a secret. Her silk robe clung to her frame, hair tousled by the dry electric air. Below, the cacti bent, palms shivered, the sky crackled without light. Inside, the mansion slept, or pretended to. She wasn't sure what pulled her from her bed that night, only that she couldn't breathe in the silence of her room anymore. Something inside her chest was too loud, too restless. Her fingers curled over the railing, knuckles white. Behind her, she heard the faintest shift of air. She didn't turn. She knew it was him. Jonathan. He said nothing at first. Then quietly, "You should come inside. The wind can be dangerous." She didn't move. So can silence. A long pause, and then footsteps, slow, careful, until he stood beside her, hands in the pockets of his dark shirt, eyes fixed on the horizon. They stood like that for a long time, two silhouettes carved from tension and memory, neither touching, neither speaking, until Lily broke the stillness. "Why are you so afraid of me?" Jonathan turned to her, frowning slightly. "I'm not." "Yes, you are," she said. Her voice was steady, but her heart wasn't. "You keep your distance. You barely look at me. You treat me like glass. I'm trying to respect you." "No," she said, turning to face him now, eyes burning. "You're trying not to feel anything. Because if you do, you'll have to admit that this marriage isn't just a deal anymore." He exhaled slowly, as if the truth hurt. "I never wanted to trap you, Lily." "But you did." His jaw clenched. "And every day I try not to make it worse." Her voice softened. "What if worse is pretending there's nothing here?" That silenced him. Because it was there, unspoken, unbroken and building. They had been orbiting each other for weeks, almost touching, almost speaking honestly. She had seen it in his eyes, felt it in the way he paused when passing her in the hallway, the way he left books outside her door, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. He took a slow step forward. "So, what are you saying?" She didn't answer. She reached out instead, just lightly, her fingertips grazing his hand. It was like touching flame. His breath caught. He looked down at their hands, then at her, and something shifted behind his eyes, a fracture, a surrender. Then he kissed her. No warning, no hesitation. Just a sharp, aching collision of mouths that had waited too long through too much silence. It wasn't gentle, it was desperate. Lily felt it all at once. The years between them, the grief, the guilt, the weight of everything they hadn't said. His hands found her face, steady but trembling, and her fingers dug into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer like she had no idea where she ended and he began. He kissed like a man who had buried love once and never expected to feel it again. And she kissed him back like a woman who had grown up in shadows and was finally reaching for light. When they broke apart, both were breathless, shaken. Jonathan stepped back first, his chest rising and falling fast. "This is dangerous," he said, almost to himself. Lily's voice was quiet. "So is pretending we're nothing." He looked at her, not just her body, not just the ghost of her mother in her face, but her. And for a second, something in him broke open. "I look at you," he whispered, "and I see everything I tried to bury, and everything I never deserved." She didn't blink. "I'm not her. I know. Then stop punishing me for what you lost." He closed his eyes. A pause. The wind howled. When he opened them again, they were different. Not colder, but distant. "I can't give you what you want, Lily." "Then tell me what you want." Another silence. And then he turned, walking back into the house, leaving her on the balcony, alone. But this time the silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. Because once a wall breaks, even with a kiss, it doesn't rebuild the same way again. It began with dust. Not symbolism, not drama. Just dust. A fine layer covering the top shelf of a forgotten bookcase in the west wing of the mansion, where Lily had wandered restlessly after a night of no sleep and too many questions. She hadn't seen Jonathan since the kiss. 2 days had passed. 2 days of silence, of rooms too quiet, of meals skipped, of hands clenched under covers at midnight, remembering the way his lips had trembled against hers, not from desire, but from restraint. She needed answers. Not just about him, but about her mother. About them. About what came before her, before the deal, before the lies. The West Wing had always felt like it belonged to someone else. Colder, older, full of shadows and echoes. She had wandered past portraits and sculpture halls until she found the library, untouched, dust-lined and smelling of cedar and memory. The bookcase was behind the piano. Claire's piano. The same one Lily had played on her first night in the house when no one was watching. She didn't know what drew her to it. Maybe instinct. Maybe something older. Maybe fate. She ran her fingers along the top of the shelf. One book didn't move. A false spine. She pulled it. There was a click. A small drawer popped open. Inside, bundled in silk ribbon yellowed by time, were letters, dozens. Each envelope was dated, all in the same hand, her mother's. Claire's cursive, soft and slanted, as if the words had been written in candlelight. Some were unopened, others looked worn, as if Jonathan had read them so many times the paper itself remembered his touch. Lily didn't hesitate. She sat on the floor, robe brushing the marble, and began to read. May 14th, 2005. I saw you today. Not really you. A man who moved like you, stood like you, wore his pain in his shoulders like you, and for a second I couldn't breathe. I had to sit down. My husband asked what was wrong. I told him I was dizzy. I lied. June 3rd, 2006. She's growing inside me. Our daughter. I know she's not yours, not in the way people measure blood, but she feels like you, strong, still. I sing to her sometimes, your favorite melody. I think she hears it. December 18th, 2008. Lily asked me tonight why I always look sad when she plays the piano. I told her music reminds us of the things we love most. What I didn't say, she is the music. She is you and me and everything we never got to finish. September 11th, 2010. I heard your name in a meeting. Cold, corporate. They speak of you like a god or a machine. But I remember Istanbul. I remember your hands in mine as we watched the city wake up. I remember your voice when you said, I'll find you again. March 2nd, 2011. Lily is drawing bridges now, with no towers, no gates, just the space between two places. She says they're freedom maps. I think you would understand. I think you already do. Lily wept. Not loud, but hard. Not because the words were beautiful, though they were, but because for the first time in her life, she heard her mother's voice. Not as a symbol, not as a story told by strangers, but as a woman, a mother, a lover. Claire hadn't been a victim. She had made choices, imperfect ones, fierce ones, brave ones. And Lily, she hadn't been an accident. She had been wanted, dreamed of. Even if the world had tried to turn her into a chess piece, she had once been something tender between two people who had no place to be tender. At the bottom of the box, she found a final envelope. Different, labeled simply, for her. When she's ready. She opened it with trembling hands. My Lily, if you're reading this, it means the world did what it always does. Broke something that mattered. I'm sorry. I didn't want this life for you. I wanted fireflies, and late-night ice cream, and a home that wasn't built on silence and suits and contracts. But I also wanted you to be strong, and I think you are. I don't know how your life will unfold. I don't know what name you'll carry. But I hope you know this. You were not born to serve legacy. You were born to feel, to build, to choose. Jonathan, he is not perfect. He is made of walls and shadows and storms. But he loved me. And in a way I didn't understand at first, he loved you too. If you ever wonder if you were just a strategy, I hope this letter reminds you that you were once a dream. Ours. Yours forever. Mom Lily pressed the letter to her chest, and for the first time in years, she felt something open inside her. Not forgiveness, but possibility. She stood, walked through the library, and down the long hallway toward the West Wing bedroom where she knew Jonathan slept but rarely rested. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. When she opened the door, he was sitting by the window, shirt half-buttoned, eyes heavy, as if he had felt her coming before she moved. She didn't speak. She held up the letter, and when he saw it, his whole body stilled. I found them, she said. He nodded once. No apology, no panic, just a kind of reverence. She wanted you to know. I do, Lily whispered. Silence bloomed between them, the soft, waiting kind. Then carefully, like someone testing the edge of a knife, she asked, was I really a dream? And the way Jonathan looked at her then, with grief, with awe, with something like devotion, said more than any vow ever could. It rained in the desert, a rare, impossible rain, the kind that comes once in years, sudden, holy, like the sky had been holding its breath too long and finally let go. Lily stood barefoot in the garden, the marble tiles slick beneath her, rain soaking her hair, her nightgown clinging to her like skin. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just let it fall. Inside, Jonathan watched from the glass doors. He should have told her to come in, handed her a towel, spoken something practical like he always did. But he couldn't, because something about the way she stood there, untouched, unafraid, cracked him open in a place no logic could reach. He stepped outside. The rain was warm and relentless. She didn't turn at first. Then slowly she looked over her shoulder, and he saw it. The soft surrender in her eyes, the hurt still there, but also the question, "Will you come closer?" Finally, he did. No words, just two people soaked in memory, silence and something neither of them could control anymore. "You always hide," she said softly. Jonathan's voice was quiet. "So do you." She turned fully then, facing him, the rain running between them like breath. "I'm done hiding." She stepped closer until there was nothing between them but air and fear. Jonathan raised a trembling hand, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. His fingers lingered at her temple, down her jaw, like a man relearning touch. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Neither do I." She took his hand, placed it over her heart. "But I want to try." He closed his eyes. And for the first time in 20 years, Jonathan Blake let go. He pulled her into him with a gentleness that felt like breaking. Their lips met, not in hunger but in ache. The kiss was soft, deep, soaked in everything they never said. His arms wrapped around her waist, her fingers curled into his soaked shirt. She pressed her forehead to his, whispering against his mouth, "Don't run from me." "I've been running toward you," he breathed. "I just didn't know how to stop." They moved together, slow, reverent like prayer, back through the house, dripping water along marble floors, breathless in each other's gravity. When they reached her room, he paused. "Are you sure?" Lily reached up and unbuttoned his shirt, her hands trembling, not with hesitation but certainty. "I've never been more sure of anything." That night, they didn't make love to forget pain, but to remember softness. There was no urgency, no need to impress. Just skin against skin, eyes locked. A rediscovery of humanity inside two people the world had tried to turn into statues. He kissed every scar she didn't know she carried. She whispered every truth he had buried beneath walls. And when they lay wrapped in silence, the rain still falling against the windows, she rested her head against his chest and said, "I don't want to be a memory for you." "You're not," he whispered. "You're the reason I came back to life." He traced his fingers down her spine. "I was afraid of loving you," he confessed, "because I loved her and it ruined everything." Lily looked up. "But I'm not her." "No," he said. "You're the proof that love can begin again." She smiled softly, not because it was perfect, but because finally it was real. They slept tangled in each other's arms, no longer two strangers in a contract, but two souls that had been circling each other through lifetimes, finally meeting without fear. And in the stillness of that early morning, Jonathan whispered into her hair, "I love you, Lily." She didn't say it back. Not yet. But she held him tighter, and sometimes that's louder than any word. It began with a whisper. Lily stood in the upstairs bathroom, staring at the pregnancy test resting on the marble sink. The line was faint, barely visible, but there, undeniable, fragile and loud all at once. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply placed a hand over her belly, as if trying to listen to a truth that hadn't yet been spoken. Downstairs, the house was quiet. Jonathan was in his office, reading architectural blueprints Lily had left on the table the night before, her latest design for a sustainable community complex in Nevada. He didn't know yet. She took the test, wrapped it in cloth, and tucked it inside a drawer, not because she wanted to hide it, but because she wanted to hold it, alone, just for a moment longer, not as a headline, not as a continuation of legacies, but as hers, their child, born not of a contract, but of a choice. The next evening, she told him. They were in the garden again, the desert now in bloom from the rare rain, jasmine and sage perfuming the air. Jonathan stood barefoot, sleeves rolled up, hands still smudged with graphite from sketching. Lily came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist and whispered, "We're not two anymore." He stilled, turned. His eyes searched hers, and when she nodded, he didn't speak, just dropped to his knees and pressed his lips to her belly. A single tear rolled down his cheek, not from fear, from something deeper, from knowing he had been given another chance, not just at love, but at life. But the world wasn't soft just because they were. The news broke weeks later. Someone leaked it, maybe from the hospital, maybe from the inner circle of business vultures still clinging to the idea that the marriage had been a show. The headlines were cruel. Blake, heir on the way. Billionaire couple, Sparks legacy war. Lancaster-Blake bloodline, billion-dollar baby or political pawn. But Jonathan and Lily didn't play defense. They made a move of their own. They held a press conference. Just one. Standing together, hand in front of the media, Lily said, "This child will inherit love, not legacy, and we're building a world that will match that promise." Then Jonathan stepped forward, and in a voice the business world hadn't heard in years, calm, commanding, dangerous, he announced, "I'm dismantling the Blake Morgan Lancaster Consortium, effective immediately." A pause. Then chaos. The three families, tied for decades in secret contracts and silent war, were stunned. The institutions shook, investors panicked, boardrooms burned, and Jonathan didn't flinch, because he had a plan, and her name was Lily. They sold properties, cut ties, rewrote clauses, broke trusts that had never been questioned before, and in their place they built something new. Lily's project, always once just a dream on paper, became real. A city. Small at first, but designed for the future. Clean energy, green infrastructure. Homes built not for profit, but for healing. The first phase was built in Utah, on land Jonathan's father once claimed for oil but never touched. Lily named it Clareville, in honor of the mother she was finally beginning to understand. They moved there 2 years after the baby was born. A boy. They named him Caleb Clare Blake. He had his mother's eyes, his father's silence, and a laugh that made the desert bloom again. Lily didn't become a public figure. She didn't want to. She worked on blueprints during the day and played piano at night with Caleb crawling between her feet. Jonathan took fewer calls, read more books, took up sketching again. And on Fridays, he walked the perimeter of the new city with his son on his shoulders, pointing to the solar panels and saying, "Your mum dreamed all this." They didn't live perfectly, but they lived present. And when they argued, it wasn't about power. It was about how to plant more trees, or whether to let Caleb sleep in their bed for the 3rd night in a row, or what story to tell him next. They spoke often of Claire, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in laughter, and always with gratitude, because without her, without everything she endured and hoped, none of this would have existed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the copper horizon, Lily sat on the porch with Caleb in her lap. Jonathan brought her tea, sat beside her, and asked, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't found our way back?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at the boy in her arms, at the city in the distance, at the man beside her who once lived like a ghost and now smiled like a father, and then she said, "I think love would have waited anyway." Jonathan leaned in, kissed her temple, and whispered, "It did." In the end, it wasn't the contract, nor the past that united two broken worlds. It was what they chose to build, despite everything. Because sometimes the truest love isn't the one that comes with promises, but the one that is born from silence, healing, and the courage to start over. And you? If you discovered that your life was decided before your first yes, would you have the strength to rewrite the ending? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and comment below. Where are you listening to this story from? Your like helps the channel grow and continue bringing emotional stories like this one. Share it with someone special.